What's up, guys? Michael here to talk about the high school show that has parents confiscating body glitter all over the country. That's right, Euphoria. It provokes vivid reactions, whether people are crying over Rue's latest relapse, squirming at Nate's improbable awfulness, or counting on-screen dongs like Pokemon. Euphoria's garnered plenty of praise for its expressive cinematography and raw treatment of contemporary high school life, but not without controversy. Some say it glorifies teen drug use and other naughty behaviors. Others argue that it puts the audience through the emotional ringer without substantial payoff. But whether you think this is prestige television at its best, or trauma porn at its most shameless, chances are you probably agree that watching the show feels something like getting kicked in the stomach by a runaway donkey in a crop top. Now, it's not like the show's various themes, from addiction to queerness, can't be found elsewhere on television. But on Euphoria, everything from painful trauma to the most minor adolescent indignity viscerally hurts.
Are you making fun of me, or did you actually think I was auditioning for Oklahoma?
So what exactly makes this show so gutting? Let's explore in this Wisecrack Edition on Euphoria. Empathy is work. And of course, spoilers ahead for Euphoria. When we think about the standout moments on Euphoria, they are typically the ones that are most painful. Take, for example, Cassie's anxiety-driven, borderline violent grooming behaviors to attract Nate.
I have never, ever been happier!
Or Rue bailing out of her mom's car and going on the lam to avoid going back to rehab as her sister Gia screams in panic. To understand why scenes like these are so stressful to endure, we need to bring in the concept of empathy, i.e., the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. While philosophers had kicked this idea around for centuries, there wasn't a term for the concept until German philosopher and art historian Robert Vischer used the word Einfühlung in 1873. Translated to empathy, it would enter the popular consciousness around the beginning of the 20th century. In this way, empathy, like Joel's glittery makeup, has a distinctly modern flair. Scholar Jeremy Rifkin attributes the increasing importance of empathy to the rise of modern psychology, which encouraged people to delve more deeply into their own internal worlds, thus complicating their self-perceptions. As human beings began thinking more deeply and in a more nuanced way about their feelings and thoughts, they also started thinking about those feelings and thoughts in relation to other people's inner worlds. As Rifkin explains, it wasn't until human beings were developed enough in human selfhood that they were able to recognize the existence of empathy. That is to say, properly interpreting what's going on for Rue when she jumps out of that car first requires you to understand your own potentially self-destructive impulses and how those impulses might be perceived by other people. As psychologist and philosopher Theodore Lips put it, Einfühlung is the process of tapping into the emotional subjectivity of another person's psyche to the point where you can't tell where your feelings end and theirs begin. Like falling into a Jules, Rue, Elliot cuddle puddle, it requires connecting to someone else on a deeper level than we usually do. But at the same time the concept of empathy took off, modern society was encouraging self-contained individuality. As a result, empathy weirdly became more difficult. Just because humans had discovered what it meant to feel other people's subjectivity, it didn't mean we were good at practicing it. Indeed, studies have shown that human beings still have a tendency to see others, especially, say, people struggling with addiction or overtly sexualized women, as simple abstractions, rather than full, complex human beings. We see this behavior plenty in Euphoria. Rue is commonly dismissed as being just a junkie.
In all fairness, last summer there were like 3 weeks where I thought you were dead.
Or like when Cassie's potential hookup cruelly tells her that
any guy who says he's interested in you beyond just you is full of shit.
Here, both women are being seen as simple abstractions based on one aspect of their being, their drug use or their sexuality. True empathy, in contrast, requires seeing people as more than the sum of their parts, and attempting to connect to their subjectivity. As writer Elie Wiesel put it, we must not see any person as an abstraction. Instead, we must see in every person a universe with its own secrets, with its own treasures, with its own sources of anguish, and with some measure of triumph. Perhaps unsurprisingly, due to their ability to viscerally render characters' inner worlds, film, and later television, have long been considered useful mechanisms for eliciting empathy. As film critic Roger Ebert once said, "For me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy." Now, there's one good reason any successful TV show needs to elicit empathy. People are more likely to keep coming back week after week if they actually give a shit about the characters on screen. But Euphoria, from our view, is different. Here, empathy isn't merely a mechanism to get people to stick around. It's the entire point of the show. Euphoria most literally spells this out when Rue's Narcotics Anonymous sponsor talks about the way society reduces people struggling with addiction to abstractions.
We're too busy running around judging everybody's intentions and motivations as if we have some insight into the human soul. You know, you did this, so that must mean you're that. Just give me a break.
But more subtly, the intention of empathy is telegraphed throughout the show's visual and narrative devices. Take the episodes which feature Rue's voiceover narration.
She just knew that she had something special. Something intangible.
Now, the pilot starts somewhat conventionally, with Rue narrating her own life story.
I was once happy, content, sloshing around in my own private primordial pool.
Though, notably, it's evoking memories she couldn't possibly have, like being born and what was on TV when she popped out. This gives it a surreal vibe. And as the series progresses, that omniscience becomes more uncanny, as even the most minor of characters are given a few minutes of Rue's narration.
Or they could just sit in silence. They were that close, that comfortable.
These segments are divulged from a close third perspective, meaning it's presented in the third person but skews closely to the character's actual lived experience rather than remaining entirely objective, like, say, a news reporter would. Importantly, for the most part, Rue is narrating aspects of these characters' lives and inner worlds that she couldn't possibly have access to. This creates a surreal sense of almost uber empathy. It also complicates the ways we think about each character. It forces us to understand why each teen or adult makes some unsavory choices, and to reconsider characters whom we might normally and reflexively judge or dismiss. What the show seems to be saying about high school, and about life in general, is every person has shit going on that you couldn't know simply from looking at them or talking to them. Such is the power of empathy. It's also impossible to talk about Euphoria's production of empathy without discussing its highly stylized look and feel. First off, Euphoria traffics heavily in one-shots, especially intense close-ups, which until very recently were rarely seen on television, and still don't typically show up on soapy teen shows. The rise of the close-up was a really important transformation in film history. Early film mostly used wide shots, as if you were watching a play. But in a 1912 film called Friends, we saw what film director Paul Schrader calls the first true close-up, one of actress Mary Pickford's face. This suddenly gave us access to far more information about her emotional condition. It's perhaps no wonder then that Mary Pickford became Hollywood's true first celebrity. While actors and actresses had previously gone uncredited, the rise of close-ups made audiences start to relate to the performers as people, and thus love them as much as you love Tom Daya. Euphoria's close-ups are often slow and searching, typically featuring a face or part of a face over a blurred-out background. This gives viewers nothing but that actor to engage with, putting us as close to understanding what the character feels as visually possible. But when it's not making you want to barf in the hot tub with Cassie, Euphoria is also using the kinds of high-octane camera movements you're more accustomed to seeing in action films. While being highly cinematic, such movements also pump up our emotions. The camera might dive into a pool to express the exuberance of a drunken house party, or it might slowly dolly back to emphasize just how alone a character feels. It might defy gravity to help you get a sense of what drugs feel like. Or, of course, it might run uninterrupted through a food cart, around the grounds of a carnival, and ultimately up to a Ferris wheel, showing the personal intrigues and heartaches of each character along the way. This sequence in particular reinforces one of the show's key themes. The characters are all in the same place physically, sure, but they're each in a complicated emotional universe of their own. Such is the unadulterated roller coaster of teenage hormones, and some of those roller coaster rides are relentlessly long. It's pretty well accepted that lengthy shots can be super effective in building tension, more so than quick cutaways. That's why the lingering shot in, say, every slasher movie, when you're waiting for the killer to strike, is so much scarier than the actual slashing itself. Our instinct is to look away in search of some emotional relief. By lingering almost unbearably long in many of its shots, Euphoria doesn't give us that relief. Instead, like a slasher film, it makes us sit in the moment as the tension builds. But instead of a scary guy with a knife, the thing we're confronting is the high-intensity emotions being felt by the characters. Euphoria is also known for its endless tracking shots, which give it a feeling of constant attention and surveillance, accumulating tension with each moment, which isn't all that different from how it feels to be a teenager. Painfully self-aware, worried that everyone's watching and judging you. What's more, The colors are just as vivid as the camera movements. A bike ride to meet a crush takes on a dreamy yellow palette that evokes that ineffable sense of being in a fairy tale the first time you fall in love. Pinkish hues express the overwhelming joy of an intoxicated night out with friends. And of course, a dark blue palette emphasizes the utter depths of Rue's depression. Oftentimes in modern cinema and television, shaky handheld camera movements are used to evoke a point of view and literally put you in the character's shoes in order to better understand their experience. But Euphoria's highly stylized choices do something different. They evoke the character's outsized feelings about their experiences. As the creator Sam Levinson explained, he eschewed cinematic realism and instead strove to make each scene an interpretation of reality or a representation of an emotional reality. Each shot contributes to an emotional sense of what the character is feeling, rather than the actual movements of their everyday life. Critics sometimes wonder why Euphoria has to take place in high school, asking why the characters couldn't just be 20-somethings with fully developed frontal cortexes, a choice which would probably render the show less controversial. But the emotional realism is key to understanding why Euphoria only makes sense when set in high school. When you're a teenager, all your emotions are heightened to the nth degree. Love does feel like being subsumed in a bath of pink light. Having a drink does make the world feel like it flipped over. While we might not have had the same experiences as the way too experienced Euphoria teens have, we can certainly relate to the outsized feelings that we're cinematically persuaded to share with them. But we still haven't fully explained why empathy is so important to understanding Euphoria and its perpetually troubled teens. To piece that together, we need to look back to Rifkin, who argues that we are in an era of dramaturgical consciousness. This means we take a more theatrical view of life and our identities. All the world's a stage in a society that's ardently preoccupied with social media and subsumed by surveillance. It's no surprise that teens glued to their phones construct their lives with the attention to detail of both audience and director. And those audiences and the performances they expect to see change with every interaction. That means we essentially construct and reconstruct ourselves from interaction to interaction, like how cam work brings out a different side of Kat as she plays the role men seem to want. Now, role-playing therapy, where you act out different personas to better understand your psychological hangups, was common amongst the baby boomers in their young adulthood. But Rifkin says, role-playing is no longer a therapeutic technique, but rather a form of consciousness. Like how you play someone different on weird Twitter than in an email to your mom. In our increasingly digital reality, we are all constantly reconstructing and re-understanding ourselves in every interaction, creating dispersed identities that are more complex and nuanced than the fixed understanding people used to have about human nature. We see this in the narrative construction of Euphoria. It shows each character as complex and nuanced as they negotiate their own identity. Sometimes this is painful or uncomfortable.
Who am I? Oof. Wow.
But by, say, showing even Nate's father as a young, love-struck man, we experience a different side of him, one that isn't as easy to dismiss as a chilly monster. This is the same way understanding Rue's drug addiction requires knowing how deeply the loss of her father still weighs on her. Characters who might be depicted as unsympathetic, flat, and static on another show are thus given more context to facilitate our emotional concern for them. And Euphoria's sense of radical empathy extends to every character. We'd argue that's a pretty cool thing, and plenty of people would agree with us. In fact, moralists like David Hume and Adam Smith even argued that empathy is a prerequisite for morality. They used the word sympathy instead, but essentially described empathy. This makes sense. So much of morality is about how you treat other people, and you can't treat people well unless you understand and recognize their complexities, subjectivity, and humanity. And when we don't do that, it becomes much easier to ignore systemic issues like addiction, homelessness, disease, and even climate change. Empathy is about more than isolated interactions between individuals. It's about seeing the world ethically, and the people who populate that world not as ideas, but as complete human beings. Sometimes we even see characters learning to do just that on Euphoria, like when Rue decides not to run away with Jules because she's learned to empathize with how much it might hurt her mother and sister. Along with Rue, the audience is also developing empathy, and that's why watching the show can feel so exhausting. empathy is hard work, and it's easier to judge people based on abstractions than to genuinely connect to them, especially when you're watching people on the silver screen. Think about reality TV when someone gets a villain edit. An empathetic reaction is about as likely as a Bachelor in Paradise couple surviving their 3rd anniversary. Rue explicitly points out the chronic lack of empathy in the world.
Everyone's just out to make everyone else not seem human. I don't really want to be a part of it.
Rue's response as a nihilistic kid is understandable, but the only way to surpass these kinds of hasty judgments is empathy. And when we do choose to be a part of it, it can be a rewarding and uniquely modern experience. But what do you guys think? Is Euphoria the most compelling show on television? Is my heart being broken every week for no reason? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support, and be sure to check out our podcast. Hit that subscribe button like you're desperately pausing the TV when your parents walk in, and don't forget to ring that bell. And as always, thanks for watching. Later.